Let's get into some basics. Now, this goes for fiction and for nonfiction. So feel free to take a few notes, but I know this is being recorded. You can always come back to it. But a few little simple things we want to make sure we have under our belt before we start. Always write your blurb in the present tense. And this is a funny one. Like, it's something that I actually often forget to talk about because all of the blurbs around me are written in present tense. I always write in present tense, but occasionally I get a blurb from somebody for a critique and it's written in past tense. And then I'm suddenly like, oh my goodness, this is why we don't do this. It's so jarring to read something in past tense when you're contemplating starting a story, like buying a book and starting a story. So writing in present tense is much more immediate and captivating for your readers. If you're writing in past tense, it can make it feel like your story's already happened, like it's gone, like they've missed the boat. Sometimes they can feel like they've missed out on something, like should I have already known what was going on here or not? And it's just not, it's just nowhere near as interesting and involving for a reader. To read a past tense blurb. You don't have to match the tense of your blurb to your book. Same goes for POV, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But yeah, even if your book is in past tense, your blurb is present tense. So I think a really good thing to think about right now is that your blurb plays by a different set of rules to your book. Obviously, in a lot of ways, they're going to be really related because your blurb is talking about your book, but it does have its own rules. So you do not have to match the tense. Always write them in present tense and an active voice. And then POV is the other one we sort of get asked about a lot. So we're going to be looking at third person blurbs today. If you're a spicy romance author, and pop into the chat if you are, because I'm just curious if there's anyone here who's in that genre, then you will have noticed that a lot of first person POV blurbs are popping up in that genre. And I presume there's no real kind of answer to this, that this has happened because there's so many self-publishers in the romance genre, and therefore they're setting their own rules, which I think is really exciting, and it can be really effective and super immersive for a reader, because basically, a lot of people are reading spicy romance wanting to get involved in that story and be in the character's shoes. So having a first person blurb can kind of just set that up from the off. I have a whole other course on writing spicy blurbs because it's its own thing, which I'll talk to you about a little bit at the end. But we are going to focus on third person, and a lot of the structural things are still going to be the same. The bottom line here is that you can write a third person blurb for any book, no matter what POV it's in. It's the gold standard. No one is going to read a third person blurb. I say no one, I'm sure there's always someone out there, but generally speaking, no one assumes a third person blurb means a third person book and a third person book only. It's not the true for first person blurbs. If you write a first person blurb, your book better be in first person or people are going to get confused. But like I say, that is a whole other workshop. And Anya, if you have enough spicy romance authors in amongst the hedgies, I'm more than happy to come back for a third time. Yes, but today we're focusing on third person. And this is honestly a great place to start as well. And finally, we're going to throw out this idea of condensing. So I don't know if all of you can see me on your screen, but essentially we don't want to have this kind of squish mindset when it comes to writing a blurb, because that's just horrific. Who wants to fit 100K plus words into 150 words? Like, no, thank you. What we're actually going to focus on instead is understanding the structure and what needs to go into a book blurb. And we're going to cut to the core essence of your book and build out from there. So it's kind of like an expansive view rather than a squish, because it's just, that is what keeps a lot of authors stuck on the blurb, is trying to condense everything. We're going to start small and work out. Now, when I created Book Blurb Magic, and we're going to address this cookie cutter notion, I actually realized that in my own blurb writing practice, I was doing largely the same thing over and over again when approaching people's blurbs. And then when I investigated further, because I decided I wanted to teach how to write book blurbs, I was like, oh, all these other blurbs are doing the exact same thing. But it's actually really easy to miss, because it does always sound original so long as you are staying true to your author voice and true to your story. I mean, one of my favorite things about, doing critique workshops and things is that my mind is blown by the original stories people come up with. They're all so different. And even things that might have the same tropes or, vague plot sort of similarities are still so different from author to author. So don't be too afraid of sounding cookie cutter so long as you're staying true to your author voice. I'm going to show you a PDF in a minute that I've put together, and I'm going to show you guys how to grab a copy for yourself at the end as well. It's free. We're going to look at a fiction and a non-fiction blurb, and I'm also going to show you a couple in the wild so we can kind of understand what's going on in the real world as well. So I'm going to hopefully not mess up my, oh no, that's the homework one. Oh, there we go. Okay, changing tabs. So I'm going to just zoom in. So hopefully you guys can all see that okay to read. But like I say, you can download a copy of this as well at the end. So I've got a fantasy blurb here that we're going to look at. So this one is one that I wrote for a client. She gave me permission to share it. It was really fun to write. And I've gone through all of the elements of the structure. So once you know what pieces of the puzzle you need to start putting into place, it makes it easier to decide what information you then need to pull out of your book to flesh out these sections. So let's go through this. At the beginning of every book blurb, we need to have a hook. So a hook is different from a tagline. So a tagline appears on the front cover of your book, and it's kind of like, you know, like movies have a tagline, that little thing that they have on the poster. I always come back to the Johnny English example because it's one of my favorite films. He knows no fear, he knows no danger, he knows nothing. It's actually in the book Blurb Magic course because I love it so much. But that is your tagline. A hook is what appears at the top of the book blurb, and it's the stop the scroll moment. If they're going through Amazon or if they pick your book off the shelf, we really want this to grab their attention and get them interested. Now, if nobody gets past your hook, then it hasn't done its job. So we want them to have to read the next few sentences. So it's really important with a hook that you keep it short. So 1 to 2 short sentences for maximum impact. And you also do not want to convey any important information in the hook. So we don't introduce names. We don't start explaining the types of magic in the book, for example. We don't start talking about different countries. We don't give away any information that, if the reader were to skip the hook and keep going, if they missed out on, they'd be confused later on. So you need to kind of, yes, assume that the hook is going to be the reason the reader keeps reading, but also occasionally, and I'm very guilty of this, when you pick up a book and the hook is in like a slightly different font or separated from the blurb slightly, I have, for example, just skipped the hook because I know I'm interested in the book and read this part of the blurb. And then the first sentence hasn't made sense because the author made me rely on the hook for important information. The last thing we want our readers to have to do is to go back. We want the blurb to be like this slippery dip all the way down to our call to action where we tell them to buy now. So it needs to be the smoothest reading experience of their life, which also means watch out for your typos, your grammar, your sentence flow, and all the rest of it. So with this particular book, I've kind of relied on a little bit of surprising paradox in the hook. So magic is the brand of a traitor. So traditionally, fairy tales, magic is such a great thing. So this is a little bit surprising. And then the most powerful becoming the most hunted. So relying on just sort of flipping these things on their head and making the reader start to ask questions like, why are the magical people the traitors? Why are they, if they're the most powerful, how come they're the most hunted? Etc., etc. So asking questions as we go through. Great question about multiple blurbs. I'm going to come back to that one. Thank you. Then we move into our setup. So in this paragraph, you need to situate the reader in either your world. So this is a fantasy book. So I had some setting up to do in terms of explaining the realms, the legendary riders, the bad guy, etc., etc. Or you can just straight up introduce them to your main character, which is what example number 2 is going to show you. So if, your book is set in contemporary Sydney, you're not going to have to explain that whole world. You can just get on with introducing your character. But in fantasy and, similar genres, you need to set up the world. Then we move on to the build-up, which is where we elaborate on the situation. So if we've had to spend the first paragraph explaining the world, then we need to get into introducing the main character in the context of that world. So usually adding about 1 extra plot point. So we've introduced Fiona, She has, believed there's no reason why she should be magical, but then family secrets come to light and she finds herself in the center of this, old conflict. So gradually building up a picture for the reader of where the main character is, what's happening around them, and what's happening to them, which is, quite a lot to do in 2 paragraphs. Then we move into raising the stakes, which can happen across 1 or 2 paragraphs as we go through. You'll notice I say paragraph. This is a single sentence. So occasionally we do have a single sentence as a short paragraph. I like to split up the main ideas with line breaks so that it's an easy skimming experience for a reader, that they don't have massive chunks of text, and that if their eye jumps from paragraph to paragraph, there's always something interesting for them to read. So you'll notice this raise the stakes section goes across sort of two short paragraphs. So this is where we really need to address what will cause the main conflict in the story. And we need to stick to facts rather than running away with an inner monologue or the main character's feelings, because we want the reader to be resonating with what could possibly happen. So my big rule is that your readers don't care about the characters yet. So they will care about them, they will love them, but it's very hard to care about them. Let's assume this is book 1 in a series and then new readers to you in the space of 150 words. So what we need to do is try to balance that with some concrete consequences. So, she's forced to flee her hometown. She's struggling with the truth of her identity. We've got some emotional, but also a very concrete thing. Secondly, we've got unraveling ties that bind the past, threatens to tangle her in a web of nightmarish proportions. So again, a bit of emotional and a bit of there's something really significant happening that's going to have very real consequences for her in the real world. At this point, you can also introduce a secondary character if they're crucial to the plot line. I don't recommend introducing any more than 3 names, 3 characters in a blurb, and 2 is best. Names, for some reason, are just a lot for us to process. Back when I was reading Animal Farm in high school, just the first few chapters of that book, the amount of characters they introduced, and I mean, it's the same for a lot of fantasy books as well, can feel like a lot of bombardment. And in a blurb, that's even more so. So we've really got to try and keep names to a minimum, but this is a super important character. What you'll notice is that I've mentioned the name of his kingdom, but not him. I've actually left his name out and I've just focused on describing him just to reduce that kind of cognitive load. And then we get to the punchlines. So here we raise the stakes further. We highlight the worst case scenario. This is not the time to be polite about what may or may not happen in your book. We really need to ram home, this is the destruction or salvation of those she loves most. It's as concrete as that. And use of contrast works really well here. In doing an effective punchline, again, you want to tread this line between highlighting emotions and also highlighting a very real and concrete and relatable. When I say relatable, I don't mean that all of us would necessarily relate to the destruction or salvation, but we can imagine that. Whereas if you're talking about your character, she may never find the courage to find her true self. You're kind of don't know them yet. That's nice for her, but it doesn't kind of hit home the same way as something more concrete does. So I'm going to jump into the chat because there's been some really interesting questions before I get to these last couple of things. Yes, only hold 7 bits of information at a time. We can indeed. This is where my education degree comes in handy because yes, all of that knowledge is super important. Okay, can you have multiple blurbs, one for the back of the book and one for Amazon? You can. In fact, when I first started writing blurbs, I used to write 151 for the back cover of the book and a 200 to 250 word one for Amazon. I cringe now about doing that because there is no way you should be on for 250 words. No. 200 words is the max. I think you can get away with a few extra words, like maybe one small additional paragraph for the Amazon description. But I actually tend not to do that now. So when I write blurbs for my clients, we just write one and they use it for the back cover. And the only difference is this bit, the scroll up and click buy now. Obviously, you're not going to put that on the back cover of your book, but you must tell readers as they're scrolling through on Amazon where to go next. If you've held them successfully through your whole blurb, use that momentum and tell them where to go next. So